Hi, welcome to Lean Blog Interviews. I'm your host, Mark Graban, and we're joined today. Our guest is Mike Hoseus. He is the Executive Director of the Center for Quality People and Organizations and President of Lean Culture Enterprises. He supports organizations in their lean journey, focusing on leadership and cultural aspects of the lean transformation. Mike is an adjunct professor with the University of Kentucky's Center for Manufacturing. Mike developed his TPS skills at Toyota at TMMK in Georgetown, Kentucky, where he worked at the general manager level in both production and human resources, being mentored by his Japanese sensei. He's the co-author with Jeff Leiker, who's been on this podcast a number of times, of the book Toyota Culture, the Heart and Soul of the Toyota Way. It's a great book. It received the Shingo Publication Award in 2009. So, Mike, thank you for being here on the podcast. How are you?
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me, Mark.
I feel like it's long overdue. I have no good reason why I didn't. I think it's my lack of invitation, even though I've been a big fan of your work and we've crossed paths before. I'm thankful we can have a good conversation today.
I'm likewise.
One thing I wanted to mention, and something Mike and I had talked about recently, he can fill in some details on this. We'll put a link in the show notes. But Mike has been organizing a learning tour, a study tour to Kentucky, taking advantage of the opportunity to visit Toyota in his backyard and kind of my backyard. It's labeled a High Performance Culture and Lean Leadership Tour or trip. It's October 15th to 17th. I'm going to be there. Thanks to Mike for that. I'm really looking forward to it. Mike, before we get into other topics, can you tell the listener more about this tour?
It's a great opportunity because, we're mixing a couple things, the discussion and content on culture, but then the Gemba and including Toyota. So, I've talked about the book, and I appreciate you mentioning that. Talked about the book to several organizations around the world and the country, and always talk about Toyota. It's like, but you need to come and look. So we're organized where we can go and see. And so it's set up with those 3 days. We have a half day, of discussion and exercises and things in the room, and then we go to the Toyota Gemba on the first day, and then we go to a couple other area manufacturers who are on their lean journey. The next 2 days, and those we get good feedback on both. Of course, it's good to see the Toyota in the kind of the ideal state, but that blows away a lot of people and overwhelms them. And then to go to a smaller organization and get to talk to the management team and share the struggles that we're all going through on this journey is a lot more relatable and helpful to people. So it's the combination of both that we have found to be helpful.
Yeah. I mean, it's great to be able to go to the Gemba related to a learning event. There's no substitute for that. I've done the Toyota Georgetown tour and the tour in San Antonio where, you're driven through on a tram and you hear some things and you can get a sense of a place. Like what I've been in Japan, as an industrial engineer, I geek out over actually being able to stand in a catwalk
right.
on a walking tour and actually watch 5 or 10 repeated job cycles. You see the standard work, the choreography, if you will. You see the things that happen that lead to an Andon cord pull.
Right.
That's a great opportunity. So this tour is maybe a chance to see more detail than being driven through.
Exactly. And then again, that discussion with the leadership teams from the other companies is what's been, again, helpful to the group that comes. And then we do take a side trip, fun tour to a distillery each time.
Yes, I am not opposed to that. Mine as well. When you're there in Toyota's backyard.
That's right.
And it's funny you talk about seeing different types of factories. I've been on a number of tours, whether it was in Japan or in Texas, healthcare people, and seeing that Toyota plant was literally the first factory they had ever set foot in. It's just kind of an interesting, it's not their fault, but like lack of context of what bad looks like and what bad feels like. And not that Toyota is perfect, nobody's perfect, but it's It's just interesting to hear what people see and reflect on without that context or the scars or wounds that come from working in a factory with a lot of
Right,
problems.
right. So I'm glad you were able to mention it, and I hope we can get some folks to join us in Kentucky.
Yeah, and there's a discount code available. Thanks to Mike for that. It's just my last name, Graban, right?
Yeah, so I guess, like you said, if you could put it in the notes, it's focusinleadership.com, and then look for the Kentucky event. But if we can get that in the notes, that would be helpful, I think, to people.
Yeah, yeah. I'll make sure there's a link in the notes for that. So, Mike, I've read Toyota culture, some of your stories in there, in particular about mistakes and a culture that values learning from mistakes and improvement. And we might get to hear. There's one story in particular I might prompt you to try to tell.
I know which one it is.
Yeah. But before we dive into that, I mean, I like to ask guests on the podcast here, if I have a standard question, it's to learn about someone's lean origin story, if you will. Like, I'd love to hear about, some of your early days or what you recall from getting started in Toyota and being exposed to TPS, there in Kentucky.
Well, I mean, like you said in the intro, it was really once in a lifetime experience. The plant in Kentucky was the first wholly owned Toyota plant outside of Japan. So they sent, you said sensei, I had sensei. So there was, at last count I heard, 400 Japanese trainers helped start up that plant. And one of them had a role in the plant, and that was the president. All the rest of them were our coaches. So every supervisor and above had a personal coach. So I was a group leader, supervisor. And so I had a shadow, a personal coach teaching me the Toyota production system. And more importantly, these Toyota way things, we didn't call it at that time, but these cultural things. And so, I mean, my goodness, what an opportunity. And then each promotion I got, I had a new trainer, and then coordinators at the manager level teaching me the same things. And so it was phenomenal. And again, they took people without auto experience. I always tell a story. I worked at Toys R Us before that.
Oh, so this Toyota was your first manufacturing company.
Yeah, and I'll tell that story quickly because it's funny. My wife was my current wife of 37 years. We were married about 3 months before I went to Toyota. But anyway, she was transferred down to a hotel in Lexington, and it was the Residence Inn where the Japanese were staying.
Oh.
And they said, they met her, and of course, and said, have your fiance, me, put in an application. I said, no, that's not a good idea. I don't know anything about manufacturing. I've never been in a plant. And I don't even like to change my own oil, by the way. So, so not a good fit. So she comes back the next weekend, and we're talking, and she said, I talked to them again, and they said, you're exactly the type of person that they're looking for. And I said, you told them everything I know nothing about? Yes. And they said, you're exactly the type of person they're looking for. I'm like, okay, well, then I'll have to check that out. Yeah. And so my point was, like, I had a blank slate, literally, like I was a sponge. And I just wanted to learn. And of course, they were there to teach. Yeah. And so it was a good match. And
well, so had you been in a management role then at Toys R Us?
I was in a management role at Toys R Us. Yeah.
Some leadership experience and
but
they interviewed for.
It's funny because they interviewed for, and those are those competencies. And again, these are these things I learned, once I got there and then got to HR. But they were interviewing for the competencies again of teamwork, that respect, those values, and then that problem identification and problem solving. Yeah. So again, how apt are you to admit those problems and identify those problems and then solve them? So I gave them, my Toys R Us examples of that, and obviously passed the test.
Yeah. But realizing that they were going to coach and develop you along the way.
Right, which was their point. Like, we'll teach you, to build a car, and that type of thing. You can't teach, some of these other values and things, but these other competencies, again, of problem identification and problem solving, we can develop, right, and improve the capability. And so that was my memories of it, just like totally soaking in. And then the other one is, again, this I know we'll talk about this this kind of freedom of that mistakes are okay and identifying the problems. Like those were the stories, all right. Because those were
Mhm.
contrary to our human nature and
Yeah.
our thinking. And then the other thing I remember is that they were always working to simplify. And I was a couple years out of college, where, when you're writing your term papers in college, trying to do the opposite, and then they're making it like how to make it simple, and so those were some of those early memories.
Yeah. I know. I remember, the former Toyota people I've talked to, David Meyer, co-author with Jeff Liker of the Toyota Way Field book and Toyota Talent.
Right,
I,
right,
yeah.
yep,
That David had previous manufacturing experience, and we've talked on this podcast of he had to unlearn
yeah,
some habits, and that was part of the challenge for him.
yeah. And those we had. I think the agreement with the governor or something was 5% auto experience and 95% Kentuckians. And so there were stories about those 5% the same way with Dave, that having to unlearn. And I think that was
Yeah,
why they wanted 95% with the blank slate.
yeah. Now, as you were saying, you didn't think it was a good idea at first because you didn't have direct relevant experience. But I mean, from early days, did it grow on you quickly? Of like, oh, okay, I see what they were looking for. This is an interesting challenge. This could be really good.
Probably first couple of months, years, I think. Because again, I was just a sponge, and just the other dynamic there that I learned is I was doing what they were telling me.
Uh-huh.
Unlike some of those experienced people who were questioning it, I didn't know enough to question it. I just did it,
Hmm.
and then I ended up being one of the first two group leaders who were promoted. So that's when it dawned on me. It's like,
Mm.
oh, I must be doing the right thing. And again, I was
Yeah,
only doing what they were teaching.
yeah,
So that worked out well that way.
yeah. I mean, having a coach by your side, I imagine a shadow, as you were saying, you build a good relationship. I mean, I would hope or think part of coaching is allowing the student to push back or challenge things, and maybe might get a good answer back of why why you're wrong, or kind of helping you think things through.
Yeah, that came a little later, honestly.
Yeah, yeah.
Those first coaches, again, at the floor level, didn't speak English. So
Mm,
those team leader trainers, group leader trainers were team leaders and group leaders from Japan, and
hmm.
no English. So we
Yeah.
drew a lot of pictures, and we had translators that would float around,
Hmm.
helping us all.
Yeah.
So I did a little bit of kind of questioning on that, and some examples again with a translator. More of that dynamic was later with what we called the coordinators, and those were engineers and managers who did speak English, so we could
Yeah.
have that more than that, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah. And I've heard, maybe this is a good time to ask you about, you mentioned freedom, that mistakes were okay. I've heard David Meyer's story. Isao Yoshino have told similar stories about the reaction they got to a mistake. You tell a story. I've heard you tell it at a conference, and it's in the book Toyota Culture. I cited it, a brief version of it, in The Mistakes That Make Us. Hoping people would go pick up Toyota Culture for a deeper dive. But could you tell that story? And
Yeah,
wait,
I'll tell you.
did it become a nickname or just
Yeah, the
temporary?
scratchy story, I think, is the is the story, and and I told her because it was true, and it really
Yeah.
made an impact on me. Um, and then I would tell it in my conferences and things, and I was like, I felt kind of almost guilty, like repeating it over and over. And so then one time I didn't say it because I was like, I'm not going to keep saying this story. And like a group comes up to me afterwards and like, why didn't you tell the scratchy story?
It's a great story.
I'm like, because I tell all the time. I brought 4 people here to hear that story. So anyway, I didn't want to build it up too much, but it was the true story. Again, they sent us to the line. As group leaders, we were said, hey, we were told you're not going to be working on the line. That's not your role. But we want you to have respect and empathy
Mm,
for those folks who are, and it's a hard job. And to be on a line, 8 hours, we build a car a minute. And so we want you to get a feel for that, and like you said, learn the standard work, learn the Andon and et cetera. So, and then again, I remember what I'm saying on the way over. Now, at the end of 4 weeks, you won't be building every car, so don't worry about it. And on we go. And so I tell people, I'm sitting on the airplane, I'm thinking, how will I not be able to do a 60-second job after 4 weeks? Like, they must not know us Americans very well. I'm 25 years old, athletic. I'm like, I'll show them. I'll be the first one who does it. And so I always tell people they were right. I couldn't do every car after 4 weeks, but I was dying trying. So they literally give us 15 seconds worth of work each week. So they teach us the first 15 seconds work. But you know how long it took me to do that? Way more than a minute, that first week. And then I knew I was getting good or better at the end of the first week because I could do 15 seconds worth of work in less than a minute. And so,
and the regular team member was doing the other 45 seconds.
Right, down the line somewhere. So, but when I got to that 15 second in less than a minute, I felt good because the trainer could kind of come and go, and I could be on my own. So then I literally scratched one of the cars, and I'm working underbody chassis, putting in a fender liner, and I scratched a car, and I'm like, oh my gosh! And I look around, and there's nobody seeing me. Yeah. And so that was my kind of moment of truth. And again, I talk about what should be happening, right? And what should be happening is I should pull the Andon. Yeah. But I tell them nothing in me wanted to pull that Andon. Again, human nature, pride. They were telling me good job. I was doing well. Like who wants to say I may just screwed up, right? I mean, yeah. And so I look at the scratch. It's like it's a small scratch. It's under the fender. Like who's going to see that? I don't think it's that bad of a scratch. I think I'm going to let it go. And so I'm doing the rest of the car. The rest, 30 seconds more work or whatever. And again, my conscience getting me. Well, they told me to pull it out. I don't know. And then I don't know if I'm right before I left, I'm like getting paranoid, thinking maybe they have hidden cameras around here or something.
It's a test.
And now it's a test. And am I going to fail the test? Like to tell them. So I pulled the Andon, and of course the team leader did the repair, but then he hung out with me for 3, 4, or 5 cars, and he gave me a long-term countermeasure to brace it with my other hand there or whatever. So I'm thinking it's done, all right. And then, I also explained to people, the huddle meetings, and not a lot of companies, shut the line down for operators to talk. Yeah. And so Toyota does it twice a day. And so, 2 hours after startup, the team meets with their 4 or 5 folks and talk about safety and then other problems. And in the afternoon, it's 4 or 5 teams together. So 20, 25 people, and the group leader facilitating and quality discussion and then other problems. So it's the afternoon. Again, I don't understand Japanese, so I didn't partake in any of the meetings. So I just listened to them and jabber Japanese, and on we go. So they're jabbering Japanese that same way that afternoon. And all of a sudden I hear them say, Mike, son, and that's what they called me. And I'm looking I'm like, okay. And then I realize they're not talking to me. They're talking about me. And so I'm listening a little closer. Then I hear them say scratchy. So that translated pretty clearly. And I tell people I got upset. I'm like, I cannot believe the team leader is ratting me out in front of 25 people. Yeah. Like that is not a leadership concept. Like you're not supposed to tell people about the guy screwing up in front of everybody. I'm like, thanks.
Sounds like he's making fun of you.
Exactly. Like, no, I'm not making fun, but just telling him. Tell him I screwed up. Like, thanks a lot. Like I pulled the Andon. We handled the problem. You fixed it. You repaired it. So why are you telling everybody? So then I'm like, what's going on? So then the bells and whistles go off again. There's no translation. I don't know. And so they all start streaming back to the line, but they're coming right past me, shaking my hand and pat me on the back. And I'm like, are they telling me goodbye? Like, what are they doing? So I pulled out my request for a translator card. And so the guy said, somebody take my place. And then I see her talking to the group leader. And then she goes and talks to the team leader. Then she comes over to me and she says, Mike, son, they want to thank you. And I'm like, For scratching their car? No. For telling them that you scratched the car. For pulling the Andon. Oh, and she says, yeah, it was like, they said it was a small scratch under the fender. It could have got all the way past inspection. More likely, they would have found it, and they would have, and they had to waste time and effort tracking it back to root cause. By you telling them, neither of those happened, and that's why they're thanking you. Like, oh, well, that's a different story.
Yeah, right.
Now I'm happy with that team leader recognized my good behavior in front of the whole group. Right.
Yeah.
So that was my introduction to problem identification, and mistakes are okay. But again, we have to talk more because you can't just stop there. But
right.
But
if the story ended with, "Oh, mistakes are okay," I mean, they're not saying who cares.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, well, I've heard people say sometimes, like, well, there's humans involved. There's always going to be human error. So what can we do? And I'm like, well, answer that question.
Right.
What can we do? Like, did they help put some sort of, was there a systemic fix that could be put in place to prevent that type of scratch?
Well, so there's not a POGIA, but people ask me that back here. They're like, well, wasn't that part of the standard work for putting your other hand there and bracing that? And I said, well, they didn't train me on that initially, and then I wasn't close enough to where I would to learn that. But I can tell you, when I went back to Kentucky, I was on that process because that was my part back home. That was in the standard work and the training, right? Was to put that other hand there. So I'm assuming they made that part of the system going forward, but I don't know, but I did.
Yeah. I mean, it's a lesson learned, and just think of workplaces where people are right to fear speaking up, or they've experienced punishment or shame or negative consequences for pointing out an issue. People learn quickly not to do that. Like, I don't know if you've met anybody who left Toyota and went to go work for a different automaker. I mean, you talk about the culture being the heart and soul of the Toyota way or TPS. Like, I have this thought experiment. It's probably happened to somebody. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Of, let's say somebody has any length of experience at Toyota and it's ingrained, and they have the habit of pulling the Andon cord, and they go to a different automaker where maybe there is no Andon cord, or they get a completely different reaction to pulling the Andon cord. Like, when I saw at General Motors 1995, we didn't have Andon cords in engine parts machining. But if there had been an Andon cord, people would have gotten yelled at, because people did get yelled at for doing things that slowed production, because that was sadly the primary function. I mean, I think people, a Toyota person, through no fault of themselves, would learn very quickly in a different culture to not pull the cord. Right.
No doubt. Like you said, the leadership sets the culture. And, I think, well, the Andon, of course, that's the groundbreaker that Andon I love, because it's a tool, but it's also this cultural driver, right? It's also a system. And, I always ask new hires, how many times a day you think the Andon pull? Because, as a manager, I got an hour with them that first week. And of course, I didn't want them to be scared of pulling the Andon like I did. So that was one of my first messages to them, was making sure they knew it was safe. But I would get their attention by, having them guess how many times a day the Andon's pulled. And I do that in my classes still. I'd say, okay, I got 500 people day shift out there in assembly and 500 people night shift. So this is, 1/8 of the 8,000. Take a guess. How many times And so I just did it last week. And, they started out, 100 or 200. I'm like, no, you're too low. And I'm telling you, Mark, when we counted it, but not we didn't post it. We just wanted to get a feel. It was like an unwritten KPI, and it was 12,000 a day. 12,000.
How many seconds are in a day times how many jobs?
You're right. Well, then you make it possible. When I put it back to, they say that's for 2 shifts. I'm like, 1,000 people. So it's basically 12 per person per day.
Yeah.
And it might be a 10-hour day. It might be an hour or 2 overtime, whatever.
Yeah.
But so it's not that many, but it's a lot. And I always ask, is that okay or no good? Because again, the Japanese, very clear on setting the standards
Hmm.
for both, the process, the product, and the people, right, and the culture. And so, is that okay or no good? And most time, people get it like that's good,
Yeah.
and that's the right answer. And then, why is it good? Because we're identifying problems, right?
Yeah. And you talk about, I love the way you kind of break up problem identification and problem solving. We can't solve problems that aren't identified, but there's some workplaces where they've done a good job of helping people feel safe to identify problems. But if there's not good problem solving, people stop speaking up
Yeah,
because like, nothing's happened. There's a professor, UT Austin, who I cite a lot, Ethan Burris, who says that's futility.
yeah,
Like if you've
right.
eliminated fear, you don't want to replace it with futility, where people say, like, yeah, I don't get in trouble, but why? I pointed out that problem a dozen times and nothing changes, so I've given up.
Well, what I've learned is, yeah, it's definitely futility, and they've given up identifying a problem. What I've learned is then they do workarounds.
Yeah,
Then they come up with the workaround, and they solve it themselves. So you're right, that's no good. And
yeah,
and that separating problem ID from problem solving, that wasn't me. That was the Japanese.
sure.
And I questioned that at first. It was like, why isn't that the same thing? And then I learned, to your point, it's not.
Yeah.
And so that's the deal. And I want to make sure we finish that thing because again, it's okay to have that problem identified.
Yeah.
But we got, that's where Toyota would put the two pillars of the Toyota way are respect and trust, and then CI. And so
Hmm.
our behaviors are always should be reflecting both of those. And so I had one trainer say, one mistake, okay, Mike. So, two mistake, no good, right? For the same thing. So the point is,
Right.
how are we going to keep it from happening again? That's where the CI
Mm.
comes in.
Right.
And we were
Yeah.
taught two questions, and so I listened to. So I want to plug your book too, because you sent. So I got to listen to your book. It's a great book,
Oh, thank you.
uh, and it intertwined a lot with again my learnings at Toyota, and then the two that we were taught. I don't know if this was like the literature or that you getting it from the Toyota people, but we were literally taught explicitly to ask the two questions. What have we learned from this, and how are we going to
Hmm.
keep it from happening again? That
Yeah.
like that was part of our leader standard work. And I got stories in the book on that with, even Don Jackson in Texas, and multi-million-dollar problems and big, big mistakes, a lot bigger than my little scratch
Yeah.
on the fender. And Don was a good, again, that's in the book, so I can quote it again,
Yeah.
because he was from Volkswagen, I think, and maybe prior to that, either one of the big three. And so he was going at it, with his General Motors training, and then he told the story that as he was getting ready to talk, he remembered his trainer telling him, "Oh, what have we learned from this, and how are we going to keep it from happening again?"
Yeah.
As he's biting his tongue, right? So two awesome questions.
Yeah. I've heard a lot of people from Toyota talk about the what have we learned from this. David Meyer talked about that, I think, when Fujio Cho was the plant
Right,
president at one
right,
point.
right. He was
Right.
the one who had the job, yeah,
Yeah.
initially. Yeah,
And eventually became CEO and chairman
exactly.
or chairman.
Yeah, yeah,
I
both.
mean,
Yeah, he was
yeah.
global
Okay. Okay.
president and CEO, then chairman of the board. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the world's best was our teacher.
Yeah. And so I've heard that a lot. And I mean, I think the other question, how can we keep it from happening again? I think that's part of, to me, a mistake proofing mindset where we're learning and there are some organizations I've seen sometimes in healthcare, where leaders react well to the problem identification, but the problem solving is not as good, where there's
Yeah.
too much reliance on, okay, well, don't do it again, be careful, you're aware of it now, don't do it again. I'm like, well, you could try that, but I don't believe the hypothesis that telling someone to be careful is really going to be effective, because I don't think the root of it is not being careful. You would
Right.
say it's a process problem.
Right. Yeah, and it's a process problem, whether it be with the part or with the the training methodology. Another story, because the other thing at Toyota, like we had these checks and balances with HR. So even as a manager, I couldn't hire anybody or promote anybody or fire anybody because they wanted a check and balance to the culture and to the values. And and so the one on mine, I had a person putting in a wrong glove box door. And I was a manager and a group leader saying, what should we do? And he was keeping his documentation. He had his meeting. So he's like, well, I was like, I'll meet with him. And I just did your quote. Like, I asked him, anything going on you can do? He's like, no. I'm like, well, you got to be more careful. Like, this is really important. Don't do it again.
Yeah.
and sure enough, the next week, Dave, he did it again. I'm like,
yeah.
I told him not to. I told him we were going to recommend termination if he did, and so I guess we're going to have to. So we did. HR comes, again as part of their job. Tell me what's going on. I'm like, here's all the documentation. Here's the numbers. Every couple of weeks, he gets the same thing over and over. And has anybody got him to a specialist or a check? I'm like, well, he's had his general physical like everybody else. Nothing's shown up. Well, can we send him to some specialist? Oh, okay. Comes back with a red-brown color blindness. He didn't know he had, not for the glove box color, for the color on the manifest. It tells him what part to put in. My God. It's a right-hand drive to the Middle East, which is a very low runner. He's only on it 2 hours out of the day because of rotation. And so whenever that car comes, when he's on the job, guess what part he puts on?
Yeah.
And because of my lack of problem solving, I'm recommending the guy for termination. So that was another lesson.
Yeah.
Of, again, problem. It's not the person. It's the problem. It's the process. And process might be part of the person, but you get the point. It's not because they're trying to make a defect.
Right. Right. And I imagine the countermeasures can include making a change to the manifest format.
Sure.
Right.
Or his eyesight or whatever, his glasses, whatever. But and then also putting in some color blindness check as part of our physical, into assembly.
Yeah.
But that's again, that's problem solving. So I appreciate your point on even when we get the thing where we get the problems identified, now we got to have the culture of getting the root cause because we can't mistake proof everything. And I had a quick little side note on that one. Last week I had somebody say, well, didn't Toyota foolproof it? I'm like, oh, they changed that name, right?
Right.
Out of respect. We're not calling anybody fools. We're trying to get their input on how to mistake proof it. Anyway, so I thought that was an interesting little.
Yeah. Well, there's I was going back through one of Shigeo Shingo's books, and he recounts that story of Toyota using the phrase "baka yoke." I have a friend who speaks Japanese, and he's like, "Yeah, baka means idiot." It's
right. Idiot.
A good insult. It's pretty direct translation, not a lot of nuance. And Shigeo Shingo tells the story of somebody getting upset about being called an idiot or a fool, and they changed it to poka-yoke.
Yeah.
And you hear it in English, dummy proofing, fool proofing, idiot proofing, or there's this kind of nasty expression of like you try to idiot proof a process, and you can always find a bigger idiot or something like that.
Yeah, right. Real respectful.
It's not. Yeah, no, it's not. Yeah. But and that was a long time ago. I think when that story when happened, and so it comes back to culture and respect. One thing I just wanted to take a quick detour back to before moving forward on respect and feeling safe to speak up. When you talk about the 12,000 Andon cord pulls every day, there's I think a common misperception. I'll hear people say, and they're being complimentary, like, "Oh, well, everyone's empowered to pull the cord and the line stops." But what percentage of the time does the problem get addressed? Before the line would stop.
Yeah, that's a great point. Because that always comes up. Right? That's a great point.
Yeah.
So 2 points on that. So the line doesn't stop when the Andon's pulled, like you said. That, and I learned later again from my HR, it's like we wouldn't want to put that pressure on the member, right? So the member's role is to follow standard work and pull it if they're not able to follow standard work. Then that sends a signal to the team leader, group leader. They make the decision whether they need to let the line stop or can they maintain safety, quality, productivity, cost, and morale without letting it stop. So I tell people when we were doing the 12,000 polls, again, those were major model changes, lots of problems. We were probably running an 85% run ratio. So 15% of the time, the line was down through the day. And now we've gotten better. So again, with that CI and what are we learning now? We're going to keep it around again. When I called back for the book, and like you said, 08 or 09 or whatever, I think they said it was about cut in half at that point in time, 5,000 or 6,000. And then when we take our groups through, Toyota plant, and I'm watching and listening, I'm estimating maybe 2,000 or 3,000. So it has gotten better again because of the result of the problem solving and the continuous improvement and the mistake proofing, right? So anyway, and now they're running 97, 98% run ratio. So maybe 2 or 3% of the time the line would be down.
Yeah. So that's such a great illustration of, there's a default or a norm or a standard of speak up, pull the cord, and then with problem solving, the need for the pulls goes down.
Right.
There are a lot of organizations. I visited a hospital in Japan that had a chart, and I've seen similar charts in the US where basically like the incident reports was increasing because they were at the stage of building psychological safety. That was not yet the cultural norm or the default. There's a US organization I saw that had the perfect pairing, though. If you see the time when the incident reports is going up because it's being encouraged, it's not punished, they're building that. And then not too long after, because they were doing a good enough job in problem solving, a different chart showing the rates of patient harm was going down significantly. It was no longer fluctuating. It was going down. Beautiful. Like that. That's the beautiful combination of problem identification and problem solving.
Yeah, that's great. And because I tell people just like that on the run ratio, 85%. So the quality is not suffering though, because the quality is improving. So you always maintain those quality standards, and then through the problem solving, now we're getting, like you said, now the productivity is coming as well.
Yeah.
If we're using that Andon again, and if quality has priority over productivity, which is another cultural leadership having a challenge, right?
Yes, a very serious one. So let's talk more directly about psychological safety as a phrase, as a concept, as a set of practices. Because I was going through and doing research for the mistakes that make us, and the one thing that's great about Kindle versions of a book, I've got a lot of my TPS and Lean library in Kindle where that phrase psychological safety might not have made the index, but you can search for the phrase.
Book, huh?
You can actually search the whole book.
Wow.
And the book you did with Jeff Leiker, Toyota Culture, was the only, and even doing a lot of Googling, I couldn't find that direct phrase. So I'm going to read back 2 short excerpts from Toyota Culture that I've shared with people. So the first quote is, "Without trust in their employers, employees are reluctant to admit to the existence of problems and learn that it's safest to hide them." Right? So we've been talking about that. And then the second excerpt, not too far from it, says, "Toyota believes people must feel psychologically and physically safe. They must believe that any concerns they have will be taken very seriously." So, I mean, we've been touching on the concepts and the leadership behaviors, but the first direct question I wanted to ask you was, like, did people use that phrase, psychological safety, or was it more implicit?
It was implicit, yeah.
Okay.
And I don't remember, again, like her and I did it together, and so But I was a psychology major in college also, so I might have thrown it in there, but I don't think so. To answer your question though, that wasn't the term we used at Toyota, so it was definitely implicit, not explicit.
Yeah.
So anyway, but whether you call it whatever you call it, right? Getting the culture, getting the behavior is what we're shooting for, right? And your points were well taken on the excerpts,
Yeah.
because that was very explicit. Just like, that was the first week on the job,
Yeah.
and they were very explicit on, and almost overboard, right, on making that a recognizable
Mhm.
reinforcing behavior, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so they had to, that had to be intentional.
Yeah.
And whether the Japanese called it psychological safety or not, that's what they were doing, right?
Yeah, and I'd be curious over time now, as the work of Amy Edmondson and others has really helped popularize the term psychological safety. And I'll go back to, I think it's kind of a amalgamation of definitions from Edmondson and others that, because I think that phrase gets misunderstood. Like
Mm,
Andon could get misunderstood, or a lot
yeah,
of things could
yeah,
be misunderstood. Psychological safety doesn't mean not being held accountable, not being challenged.
right.
Psychological safety means you feel safe to speak up.
That's it. I was thinking about this webinar. I want to make sure I got this point in because it was safe, and I was taught that early on. And I tell people in reflection, like, it was so refreshing because we spent the time on the problem, on, like you said, getting the root cause and taking it. And everybody just knew, like, you weren't going to spend time on smoke screens and deflecting blame and all the nonsense, which
Yeah.
is not efficient, right?
Yeah.
So again, it's not respectful, and it's not effective or efficient on the CI pillar. And so
Right.
it was so refreshing. It's like, just identify the problem. Now we can spend time getting the root cause and solving it. And again, it was like magical from that
Yeah.
point of view. But again, not intentional, very accidental. And I remember, even I was on a Kentucky tour, and I don't know how many years ago it was, and that, they would have these tour guides, and they've changed them now since, but it was like retired people from the community or something, and they would give the talks and things. And I'm here with these people, and we just talking about this topic, and then we take them in.
Mhm.
And I forget which problem it was. I don't know if it was the recall or the unattended celebration. One of the big problems that was in the news. And
Yeah.
so here's this tour guide, retired guy, said, well, they're having big problems, and I'm sure heads are rolling right now, or something like
Mm.
that. What?
Yeah.
No. I didn't say that in front. Now, back at the class, I was like, no. Heads aren't rolling. Like,
Hmm.
that's the point.
Yeah.
It's like, in another organization, you're finding that heads are rolling, whatever. That's not how Toyota does it.
Hmm.
And so, again, I tell people, like, on this culture thing, like, you have to be intentional on your culture.
Yeah.
And Shingo or whatever. I don't have time to get into all that, but leaders need to be intentional on their culture. And so I would recommend, again, per this discussion, like, psychological safety, or whatever way you're going to word it, needs to be part of that intentional culture.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, there's organizational culture, and you can think of roots in Japan. I'm not an expert. I've gone on 5 different study trips. I'm a recreational Toyota student, of going and visiting. And I've even asked, Masaki Amai's daughter, who was working with him before he passed, and she went and passed this question along to Mr. Amai. But I'm trying to, like, nobody can tell me, or it hasn't been unearthed, of like where there must have been literally somewhere the first Andon cord system, or the first physical Andon cord. And was it a function of, well, factories can be loud, so if you try to speak up, someone might not hear you. We're going to put in this cord that sets off lights and chimes, or music. Or how much of it is a function of Japanese culture, where I've heard people explain, as much as you can generalize, well, there's this strong norm for harmony. The expression of, like, the tall piece of grass gets cut down. Was the Andon cord, like, was the physical motion easier for Japanese team members to accept than speaking up? Or I could be completely off base, but I would
Well,
love
the
to know
story
what,
I
like.
heard on Andon, and this is
Mhm.
probably a culmination of a couple of different stories, but
Sure.
without getting too far off on the whole loom and the judoka, built into the loom, right? Where, if a thread breaks, other ones kept going. They put in the lever, right, that stopped it. So that was quality built in.
But somebody didn't have to speak up. That was like mechanical.
That was mechanical. But then when they sold that to Pratt Whitney and all that, got the money. So then the other guy takes the profits and builds cars. Then they go into the big three or whatever Ford plants and see the assembly line. But the assembly line was similar to the loom without the Jidoka, where if there was a problem, it kept going, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so then the Andon was the Jidoka to put in the assembly line, right? To take place. Like you said, you couldn't have a mechanical thing on each process.
Yeah.
And then I also heard that, one of their trips to the US, they went through San Francisco and rode on the cable car. And unlike a train that had scheduled stops, anybody could pull that cable and get off whenever they wanted to.
Yes.
And so that was, I was told, was the origin of the cord, the rope or whatever put on there, so that anybody could do it at any time and not have to wait for the scheduled stop.
That makes complete sense, because you look at, it's tacked up at certain points and it hangs down.
Yeah. It was
so
that's what I was heard. But again, it's this cultural leadership, because I've had lots of places put in ropes or put in buttons, but if the leadership is that top down or whatever, then it's not. If our heads are going to roll, then I'm not pulling them, right?
Right. So I'm guessing the Jidoka concept was already there. So I'm guessing there was this cultural intention that led to the cord. Like, this cord is going to be the manifestation of how we have people point out problems, and if it comes to it, the line stops
for the assembly line. Yeah.
For assembly.
Yeah. And there's lots of writings, right? Of Numi and that whole thing with that Andon was the difference maker.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And you're talking about, thousands of times a day. There's a news story. I'll put a link in the show notes. It was from the BBC, but they were writing about a Ford truck plant in Dearborn, Michigan, it was about 15 years ago. And the story talks about how, like, they had copied the tool. They had all the equipment. You buy it from a vendor, you install all the Andon cords. And the article talked about, compared to Toyota, the cord was being pulled a couple times a week.
Yeah, for a couple times a week.
And I'm guessing that was like maintenance, testing. Sure. They had a checklist. They had standard work of go and test the Andon cord. But it wasn't being pulled. And there was no implication in the article, thankfully, that the Ford employees didn't care as much as the Toyota employees. That was part of Ford's cultural journey.
Yeah, and it's the leadership behaviors.
Yeah.
I had another story with up in Canada. I visited this furniture company, office furniture, and they had a servant leader. He didn't even know about Toyota and TPS, and we were telling him. And his message was, raise your hand. That was his standard, raise your hand. And so then I go back a quarter later, whatever, they show me all this improvement in productivity, drops of defects. And we're looking out the second floor window there, and he's like, see it? They're raising their hand. I'm like, I can't believe this. I want to go talk to somebody right on the floor. So I picked this toughest looking dude I could find. And it was French, Quebec. And I'm like, tell me about this pulling the cord. And the translator said, he thought it was a bunch of expletives, or, BS or whatever. And, but he said, then somebody pulled it and they showed up, and they were there asking, how can I help you? And asking, and then working on the problem. And so more of us started pulling it. And then there was more pulls than the leadership. So then, you know what they did? He says, they brought the CI team down to the floor, and then the CI team would be out there when we raised our hand, also helping. And then, then we even had more people raising their hand. Then they brought the engineers down to the floor. They would jump in when they got that. And then Patrick was the lead guy. Patrick's down here. Patrick's in on a Saturday when we're raising our hand. He's there answering and seeing how he can help. I'm like, man, that's impressive. I've said, but I just saw the productivity graph where you're building like 3 times the amount of cabinets. And these are union guys, by the way, as well. You're building 3 times the amount of cabinets you were 6 months ago or whatever. Tell me about that.
Wow.
You liking that? And he said, we love it. He said, we're we're kicking the tails off of the other plants.
Yeah.
And we and he's using the term we. And
Yeah.
like, we're loving this. We're kicking their butts. And I'm like, I wish I'd been taping you on this one.
Right.
So
But there's,
it's not the equipment. It's not the bell, the whistle. It's
yeah.
the leadership behavior, right?
Yeah. But I love hearing the we and the team
Right.
mindset there. And, it's so powerful. And I've been involved in, some hospital improvement efforts where, laboratory productivity was doubled, and people, almost like the people working in that laboratory, didn't even realize it until they saw the data.
You're right.
Because and they weren't upset because we had replaced all of the BS and the workarounding that they were forced into doing. You only have 60 minutes an hour. You can only move so much. But that movement and thinking was applied to value added work.
Right, exactly.
They weren't mad about that. They were serving patients.
And the Japanese would say it's more respectful, even. Right?
Yeah.
So good stuff.
Yeah, and even, I think in adjacent to the worlds we work in, people in Eric Ries, who's considered the leader of the lean startup movement, who studied Toyota really deeply. He really emphasizes that it's not respectful to waste people's time. And that could be like, don't waste a software developer's time having them spend a year building software that no customer is willing to pay
for. Right. Yeah, not only inefficient, not respectful. Yeah.
It's interesting to frame it that way. So, boy, this is, I appreciate the stories and the things you're bringing up here. Maybe we can do another episode someday. Like, I don't want to monopolize your whole early evening. This is so fun to talk about, and we can continue the conversation and things like this, or continue my learning at this trip in Kentucky in October. We'll recap that again at the end. But I wanted to ask you maybe a different origin story, because I don't know the answer to the question of at what year did you leave Toyota and go start helping other organizations?
It was right about it
was when?
Right about 2000. It was like end of 99 or whatever. Is when.
Yeah. So I'd be curious to hear some of your early reflections of being in the Toyota fishbowl for so long, and now being anywhere else. Like, I'm sure was that a shock to the system?
Certainly, yeah. And because again, you don't have the whole systemic support, right? Mm-hmm. Of it. But I've learned a lot over it, and again, how to teach it, and the Shingo models help to teaching it with, again, what these systems are what's driving behavior. So work on the system, not being in the system, and being intentional about the culture. Which, all these things I learned at Toyota, but how do you teach it to other people? Because when you're in the fishbowl, it's a little bit more difficult. But then going out to be more explicit, to your earlier point, was some of the biggest ahas. And again, making it a standard, and because we learned that basically, whether it be on 5S, mm-hmm. or like on a leadership behavior, like. That's important, and that's an intentional culture. And just like the psychological safety, to make the leadership behavior when somebody brings you a problem, to say thank you, and to say what have we learned and how are we going to keep it from happening again. Like, those are standards that are important. And again, and so if you don't make it a standard for your organization, then leaders can be handling it different ways, and it's not a problem by definition, right? It's just their way. But if you make it a standard that, no, our way is this, then if Mark's out there saying, you idiot, why are you haven't you been in this area for 10 years and you're just now bringing it to me, or those types of comments, then we can say no good to that behavior, because it's not the standard.
Right.
So that's what a lot of the teaching I do too, is like, when you make clear behavior standards as well as your standard work standards, mm-hmm. then you can build these cultures of behaviors to hit your intention. Right?
Yeah. So maybe a final question, because you're making me think, tying it back to your origin story of getting hired into Toyota. They they saw in you and others people who could be developed in their system. Is there a process that you go through at all as a consultant or an advisor to kind of try to filter through and find clients or leaders who have similar potential, that they're willing and able to learn and apply these things more than others?
Well, it's the ones that. So the answer is yes. I mean, I don't know if I have a process other than if the leaders are involved. Because again, if they're working on this transformation or journey of culture, then I'm in. And again, and if we got the leadership engagement into that. Now, because again, if it's they're more working on tools and process, and then you're working with the CI team or whatever, then that's not changing any culture. That's getting efficiency out of some processes or something, and that's not how I want to spend my time.
Yeah.
And so if we got we got the engagement of the top leadership and the vision for this cultural transformation, then I'm in. Right?
Yeah.
And again, some of that may be learning on their part that, I didn't understand that how much I had to change or this or that, but that's different than, again, you got their buy-in initially. So
yeah, I've heard a lot of leaders say they couldn't have possibly known when they started it how much they were going to have to change.
Right. Or else
I've met some of those leaders where the transformation, if you will, started with them. And I think, the word involved is different than saying like, well, I'm sponsoring this or I'm supporting it.
Right. Yeah. There's big difference.
Leading it. Right. Well, this has been great, Mike. Mike Hoseus, again, has been our guest today. I do encourage people, the book Toyota Culture is great. If it's not already part of your lean TPS literature, I think it should be. You read these different books and you get different perspectives on new ideas. So definitely recommend that book. Again, recipient of the Shingo Publication Award in 2009. And, I hope some of you listening or watching will come join Mike and others. I'll be there on this Kentucky Learning Tour, October 15th to 17th. Look for links in the show notes. You can register using the code Graban. Mike, thank you for that gift to the audience. And please remind, it'll be in the show notes, but remind everybody of the website for both the tour and if they want to learn more about the work that you and others are doing.
Yeah, the focusinleadership.com, all one word, obviously. And then there'll be an event page, and then you'll see that Kentucky tour that Mark just talked about. So hope to see you in Kentucky.
Yeah. Not focus on, but focus in.
There you go.
Be careful. Don't make that mistake. We don't know what that other website might be. But Mike, this has been a real treat. Thank you for being a guest and for sharing so much today.
Thanks,
really appreciate it. Yeah.